Okay, folks, I think we'll make a start on this panel session. There may be some people still coming in, but so this session, I mean, I thought the interview with Douglas Alexander, for those of you there, was a really, really nice way of setting up some of the themes we're looking at in this symposium about politics and how it relates to policy making, the craft of politics. Emma's question at the end about politics and evidence, a very, very good one. In this panel session, we're trying to then look at the contribution that different disciplines and perspectives can make to research and evidence. You know, there is this assumption often in that quantitative evidence, that economists produce, that if you can do the right regressions, you get some numbers out at the end, and those numbers kind of prove your argument and make your case, and that's the best way of getting your evidence into policy making. And we want to explore the contribution that other disciplines can make, in interdisciplinary ways, but also from different perspectives, how they can be brought into policy making. So we've got a great panel for you here. We have Professor Graham Broom from the University of Bath, a social theorist who writes on complexity theory. He's got a new book out. Very interesting challenge to how we think about policy making, complexity theory, and we'll discuss that, I'm sure. We have Dr Helen McCarthy from Queen Mary, University of London. Helen is a contemporary historian, political theorist, and we'll talk about the contribution that when we think about contemporary history, what we learn from contemporary history to bring into policy making. I, for one, certainly when I was in government, always thought that if we had more historians around, we wouldn't make as many mistakes, particularly in foreign policy, but that's something I'm sure we'll discuss. And then Dr David Moon, who is, again, at the University of Bath, political theorist, also interested in the relevance of contemporary history, but also studies discourses, studies political parties, and the sort of relevance of political theory to how we think about evidence. So that's our lineup, and we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers, but we're going to start with Professor Room. Graham, I think you'll come to the
yeah, I prefer to stand up, if I may, when I speak. You've seen the title of this session, Interdisciplinarity and Evidence. I suppose my particular short presentation doesn't have its own title, but if it had one, it would be 3 Paradigms and a Postscript. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. So I want to start off by talking about the conventional approach to evidence-based policymaking. And it's what Susan Johnson in her introduction earlier described as randomized controlled trials. So that will be familiar to many of you, but I'm conscious that you come from many different backgrounds. So I'm going to start by just thinking about that orthodox paradigm. And I think that what it involves is the assumption that there may be a variety of policy interventions that are available to us. And what we want to know is what is each of their discrete impacts upon some outcome of interest. So what is the contribution of these different possible x's to the variable y of interest? We want to disentangle the effects of each of these so that the policymaker can then make his or her choices. And I think this focus upon measurable outcomes is in part related to the modern sort of contract culture, the idea that you can contract out public services to a variety of providers, and that the contract of engagement then needs to specify certain measurable outcomes that those providers are going to pursue and be judged against. So it's all part of a certain mindset that says we need to be able to measure the impact of each intervention which we're going to sponsor. And one of the reports that comes out of the Cabinet Office looking at this and providing a primer in this, if you like, is this document. So it's coming out of the Behavioural Insights team, which at this stage was in the Cabinet Office. It's now been devolved out. One of the people is Ben Goldacre, who writes for the Guardian, or used to, on good and bad science. He has a background particularly in critiquing the pharmaceutical companies and the sorts of trials of medicines that they undertake. He thinks it's not sufficiently rigorous, but in more recent years he's very much championed this sort of approach of randomized controlled trials for social policy interventions as well. So what does this involve? Again, I know that many of you are familiar with this, but some of you may not. So this is one of the diagrams from that same report, and the idea is that we start off with a population, in this case people who are out of a job, and with some of them we continue to offer them the services we're offering at the moment, and we see how many of them succeed in gaining a job. And the ones in green are the ones who've got the job. And then we offer some new program, which is different, novel in some way perhaps, and we see again how many of them get a job in that case, and as you see, many more are the successful green people. And providing that we've randomly assigned from this population to these two treatment groups, then we can infer that the increased level of success is because we have used this novel intervention. That's the simple philosophy that underlines this. Now, we have, of course, also to think about side effects, just as with a medicine that you're testing, a new medicine, you have to think about the side effects as well. You have to think about short-term and long-term effects. So we can complicate this in a number of ways, but this is the basic model, the orthodox model. And in the field of medicine, the Cochrane collaboration has been going for quite a few years now, an international effort to bring together all the sorts of good quality evidence about any given medicine or clinical intervention using randomized controlled trials. And the Campbell collaboration extended this to various fields of social policy, and the government has set up a number of centres in recent years that bring together this sort of expertise and evidence in a number of policy areas. So this is very popular. It's the orthodox approach, we might say today. Now, you can't always rely on having lots of randomized controlled trials available to you, and so we might say there's a sort of hierarchy of evidence and rigor. At the top, there are all those randomized controlled trials. We may have to be satisfied with some looser and softer evidence, so as you go down that page, you're getting softer and softer, less rigorous forms of evidence as judged by the proponent of randomized controlled trials. And so you have to really decide, well, how far down that hierarchy of evidence am I prepared to go? At what point do I decide this is just becoming too unrigorous to really be included? So again, that's part of this approach, this orthodox approach to evidence and evidence-based policymaking. So I now want to talk. That's the dominant paradigm, shall we say? I now want to talk about a critique of that, which has been developed in particular by Ray Pawson, a social work professor. And his first point is that it's fine to talk about the impact of a particular medicine, shall we say, on the health of someone or the sickness of someone. But that when we come to social policies in particular, interventions don't impact, they engage with people. They in various ways engage with the staff who are delivering the program, but also with the various target populations and communities into which those social policies are being introduced. And so Ray Pawson says in effect that the language of impact is a misleading one, and really we will think differently when we recognize that what we're trying to do in social policy interventions is to engage with the people concerned. And once we recognize that, we recognize also that there may be different groups we're engaging with, perhaps within a local area or within a school, a community, different interests. They may pose different obstacles to us. We're introducing the program into various institutional contexts. So what Ray Pawson is arguing is that really the policy intervention is unfolding, unavoidably is unfolding on institutionally diverse landscapes. That was in a sense not an issue raised in the orthodox paradigm, the randomized controlled trials, but what Pawson is saying is that it's very important, it's unavoidable that we recognize this in the case of social policy interventions in particular. Now, one of the metaphors I like to use is that the orthodox approach is a bit like standing there on a putting green. How the putter and the ball works in one part of that putting green is pretty much how it's going to work in another part of the putting green. Of course, it may have rained overnight, so you may have to adjust how hard you hit the ball wherever you're standing on that putting green. But basically, it's a uniform and stable terrain. Whereas we might describe the world of Ray Pawson as policy making as a game of crazy golf, because the terrain is diverse, there are different obstacles to be faced, and certain bits of that terrain help you. They make sure your ball goes even faster towards the hole. But Pawson is saying we do need to pay attention to this variegated landscape. Now there's a third paradigm I want to put before you, because both randomized controlled trials and Ray Pawson are both focusing upon the individual intervention. And they're asking what is going to be the effect, how is this going to work when it's employed. But of course, in the real world, we're introducing a whole range of interventions simultaneously, or interventions have already been going. When we bring our new program online, there are already a whole range of programs in operation. And those existing programs bring with them various vested interests, various institutional obstacles, and institutional multipliers. I mean, sometimes it can be a positive advantage to your program that there are already certain programs in operation which will multiply the effect of what you want to do. So some of our colleagues here in the department, Social and Policy Sciences, they're very interested in welfare to work programs for lone parents, lone mothers, getting back to work. Now what they show is that the chances of successful transition back into work for lone mothers is helped if you've got good community networks in which those women are embedded as they try and make suitable arrangements for childcare and so on and so forth. In the absence of those sorts of networks, it's much more difficult. So you as a policymaker may be introducing some programs of welfare to work for lone mothers, but it's quite important that you should be aware of the sort of dynamic synergies that may be possible between what you're doing and existing interventions. So essentially, we're talking about a policy ecosystem. The policy world is not a greenfield site on which you introduce it's not a pristine landscape on which you're going to introduce your new intervention. It's a complex policy ecosystem. And so perhaps the diagram we should have is not so much a crazy golf, but a complex dynamic ecosystem. That's what we're entering. And of course, we're not the only actors. Other actors are intervening. So another metaphor I sometimes use is of policy making on a bouncy castle. And these sort of pictures, these images, are not unimportant, I think, because implicitly, semi-unconsciously, we tend to have images of the policy world, which then shape the sort of assumptions we make. Now, these are the sorts of what I'm calling the three paradigms of evidence and policy making. And so how do we choose between them in any given context? And this diagram tries to suggest a sort of process you might go through in thinking about which of these three paradigms is the one appropriate to your particular situation. So you start off by saying, well, are there these strong dynamic synergies between the new intervention and the policy ecosystem? And if the answer is yes, then you have to really recognize you're operating with this third paradigm. You've got a complex policy ecosystem on a bouncy castle. And we have to think about, well, how can we then approach the whole question of evidence and policy? Now, if those dynamic synergies are pretty weak, so if the answer is no to my first question, then the next question we say is, well, is actor involvement important in the way that Pawson claims? Is actor involvement important for the delivery of the intervention? Now, if we're testing the effectiveness of paracetamol or some other medicine, then we really don't want the actor to be engaged and to make choices as to, whether they take 5 at a time or 1. We just give them the instructions as to what to do. But Pawson is saying, well, very often in the social policy world, the actor involvement is important. And where we find that's the case, then, so the answer is yes, we have to use paradigm 2. We have to go with what Pawson is saying. If that's irrelevant, if that's not important, then we can stay with randomized controlled trials and that orthodox approach. And often that's very convenient. I mean, it would be lovely to think that, in one sense, it would be wonderful to think that the world is that sort of linear, uniform, stable picture, because for the researcher, the policy researcher, in some ways that would make the world a simpler place to look at. So these are the paradigms I'm suggesting we need to think about. It does at least mean that we should be a bit skeptical sometimes about the claims being made by the orthodox paradigm. I mean, it's often presented to us as though this is the only scientifically respectable approach. And if you're a bit doubtful about that, you wish you would have a coherent counter argument to make. So that's what, in a sense, I'm trying to point to here. I think there are intellectually coherent and cogent alternatives to that orthodox paradigm. Those are my 3 paradigms, and I just want to make one more point before turning to my postscript. I've talked, for example, here about, well, are there strong dynamic synergies? Is actor involvement important for the delivery of the intervention? And that is not a purely technical question. The judgment of whether actor involvement is important is in part a value judgment. It's a matter of what perspective, political value perspective, we're taking as actors in the policy world. So we might say, well, if we're interested in what works, which of these interventions works, we have to ask, well, what works well for whom? We have to think about the different interests in society and the power. The language of policy effectiveness is rather technocratic, and it tends to distract us from asking about and thinking about the different political interests that shape the policy world. And so what I would argue is that good research on impact, using good evidence, it's necessary but not sufficient for good policy. So these are my 3 paradigms, but if the chair allows, I now want to give my postscript for just a few more thoughts, which I've only begun reflecting upon recently, and I still haven't worked through. But maybe that's just the sort of point one should bring to a meeting like this. So I want to ask whether there's another sort of evidence altogether that we should be thinking about. We talk about scientific evidence. We talk about the laboratory. And that's, in a sense, the sort of evidence, the sort of approach to evidence that we are using in a lot of this discussion. The point, the language of evidence is what is good scientific evidence in this context. But there's another context of evidence in our society, and that is legal evidence. Just need my water. Okay. So, legal evidence, the law court, and the public inquiry. This often involves identifying the consequences of people's actions, allocating credit and blame, calling those responsible to account, and deciding on appropriate compensation and restitution. One of our colleagues, Ian Butler, has done a lot of work on child abuse scandals, and the way the scandal develops, the way the evidence is worked through perhaps by the media, and the politics of blame that then ensues. So Ian Butler is really talking about this sort of evidence and the dynamics of this sort of evidence. And I think that when we turn back to government, the way I would put it is this. We're talking about holding to account. We're talking about assigning responsibility. Government is often interested in the devolution of blame. We often have government talking about devolution to local communities or contracting out or devolving certain services to certain agents. And a lot of it, in my view, is about the devolution of blame. So I think that this notion of evidence might fruitfully have more of a place in our discussion of evidence-based policymaking, but I haven't yet worked out how.
Okay, well, I want to thank Nick for inviting me to join this panel. And what I propose to do in the 15 minutes or so that I have is to explore the different ways in which bringing history and historical knowledge to bear on contemporary public policy problems might be useful and effective, but also to consider some of the challenges and risks of doing so. And I'll also in the process hopefully help to address, in line with the panel abstract, the question of where history and historians sit within the hierarchies of evidence which exist within government and the wider policy world. And I'm ultimately going to suggest that public policy could benefit much more than it currently does through a rich engagement with historical forms of knowledge. But to make this happen will require a very clear understanding of how and under what circumstances historical evidence adds real value alongside other forms of evidence and expertise. Okay, so why should policymakers look to the past for evidence? I think there are three key ways in which historical knowledge can bring benefits to the policymaking process. The first is its role in preserving institutional memory within government. And by this I mean a collective capacity to carry out rigorous and empirically rooted analysis of past policy successes and failures. In other words, when a policy problem presents itself, is it possible to discover in an accurate and timely fashion whether the problem has been tackled before, when and in what context, who the key officials involved were and are they still around, how the policy response was developed, how it was implemented, how well it worked or didn't work, and why. And the capacity for this kind of institutional memory does exist within Whitehall, but as Nick has already alluded to, it's rather patchy. So you have in the FCO a unit of historians who are a team of professionally trained scholars working full-time, essentially to preserve the institutional memory of the office. But in other departments, there are very few structures in place to manage this kind of historical knowledge effectively. And the Cabinet Office is currently grappling with the big challenge of preserving and organising a huge mountain of digital records, from email to PowerPoint presentations generated over the last 10 to 15 years, as well as creating new protocols for digital record keeping in the future, so as to ensure the continuity of institutional memory. There are some really important scholars doing really important work in this area of institutional memory outside government too, and the leading example would be Kath Haddon at the Institute for Government, who's been conducting a large-scale oral history of Whitehall since the 1980s, trying to capture institutional memory through using oral history techniques. And she also did some very useful research in 2009 on how civil servants have prepared for transitions of government in previous decades, and that was in anticipation of a hung parliament at the 2010 general election. So this is historical evidence in large measure about the policy-making process itself, and with a strong focus on the institutions of government. That's, of course, distinct from using historical evidence more broadly in order to understand the scale and scope of a contemporary policy challenge, be it reducing unemployment, raising educational achievement, or providing more affordable childcare. Here, history helps to explain how the wider social, economic, and political context for that policy area has changed over time, how needs and expectations of public service users have changed due to longer-term socioeconomic developments, cultural and attitudinal shifts, changes in the composition of households, changes in the structure of the economy, changes in technology, and so on. And history can also help to illuminate the impact of government policy in these broader terms, the impact of spending cuts, of specific pieces of legislation, of constitutional reform, and so on, but also, very crucially, to show the interplay of unexpected factors, unexpected consequences, historical contingencies. So I see this kind of historical evidence as helpful in enriching the context for understanding contemporary problems. It doesn't provide, of course, direct evidence of what works or doesn't work, and the randomized control trial is, utterly sort of, alien and unfamiliar to historians. But it does help to clarify the nature of the problem, and I would argue to help policymakers frame the right questions. And this is the kind of contribution which History and Policy, an initiative created in 2002 by a group of academic historians, tries to make. And History and Policy does this by publishing short, digestible policy papers and opinion pieces authored by academic historians and rooted in their peer-reviewed scholarship, and by hosting public events, training sessions, and more focused seminars with civil servants in government. And History and Policy is really trying to build capacity within the UK history discipline for policy engagement and to get the voices of historians heard more in policy debates, both in the media and within government. And it's also really trying to encourage government itself to embrace historical ways of thinking, that is, to develop its own capacity for asking questions about change and continuity, about contingency and unexpected consequences, and about deep, rich historical context. And if you haven't heard of History and Policy, I would urge you to check out their website. It's really very interesting organisation, lots of really interesting material there. Thirdly and finally, historical evidence is useful in providing a corrective function, that is, exposing the misuse of history in policy debates and broader political discourse. So this is a rather negative and reactive function, but I think an important one nonetheless. The Harvard historians Neil Ferguson and Graham Allison have recently set up what they're calling the Applied History Project at the Kennedy School of Government. Don't know whether Douglas knows anything about that or is involved. One of whose key targets is the ubiquity of the poor historical analogy, and I think we can all think of the poor historical analogies that get thrown into public discourse and political debates all the time. So Bush thought 9/11 was like Pearl Harbor, Blair thought 2003 was like 1938, and Boris Johnson thinks the EU is like Hitler's expansionist ambitions, and so on. So Ferguson and Allison want to develop a much more rigorous model for thinking about historical precedents and analogues, and for drawing lessons from the past. So those are three ways in which historical evidence, I would argue, might be useful. There are, however, challenges as well. And the first is the nature of the historian's craft. Historians, unlike other disciplines, are trained to think about particularity, to explain why something happened when it did, the way it did. Most of us became historians because we were driven by curiosity about the past, our desire to get under the skins of past societies and cultures that are so different from our own. And respecting that difference is really integral to our identity as historians. So the greatest terms of abuse that you can throw at an academic historian is to accuse them of presentism and of being ahistorical. And some academic historians strongly object to any proposition that we should be more focused in our intellectual concerns with solving contemporary problems. They see that as a threat to our intellectual freedom and antithetical to what we do as a discipline, which is the pursuit of historical knowledge for its own sake. So the past shouldn't be seen as a kind of human laboratory which we can delve into to try and solve contemporary problems. It's important in its own right, and we should respect how past societies are different from ours and trying to understand that difference rather than assuming that we can learn about ourselves in any straightforward sense by looking at the past. Now, not every academic historian sees things in quite such binary terms, but I do think there remains an unresolved tension around how policy engagement relates to our more conventional scholarly endeavours. And Neil Ferguson and Graham Allison actually talk about applied history as though it is a new discipline or a kind of paradiscipline which requires an intellectual shift of gear and a special kind of training which the conventional history PhD does not deliver. So they actually talk in their manifesto, and they've written a manifesto, of course, between mainstream historians and applied historians, implying that the former lack the skills for effective policy engagement and should just kind of carry on with what they're doing, but not pretend that they have anything to offer policymakers. A rather different agenda was pushed by Ferguson's Harvard colleague, the intellectual historian David Armitage, and Joe Gouldy, a historian of the 19th century state, in their history manifesto. Lots of manifestos. So they wrote this book called The History Manifesto in 2014. And in it they call for all historians, so they're not making a distinction, but all historians to engage more actively with contemporary policy challenges. And they saw that the key way they can do this is by tackling really big questions over very long periods of time. So things like global warming, urbanisation, war, over sort of the course of 500 years or even 1,000 years by using big data sets and new digital tools for analysis. And their claim was that academic historians had become narrower and narrower in the subjects they chose to study, that they'd become too specialised and too parochial, and had lost sight of the larger issues which studying the past can illuminate. And some historians found this a rousing call to arms. Others thought it misrepresented the state of historical scholarship, but perhaps more importantly, was prescriptive and presentist in its assumptions. And this tension between the pure pursuit of knowledge for its own sake and the instrumental pursuit of evidence to solve present-day policy problems is not, of course, a dilemma peculiar to history, but perhaps it is felt more intensely by historians than in some social science disciplines because of the nature of what we do and because we are seen as a soft humanities discipline. So what is the future of the past, then, in policy terms? Well, when I started my PhD just over 10 years ago, I didn't feel any particular pressure to demonstrate the impact of my research or to undertake policy engagement. There wasn't a real sense that this is something that historians ought to be doing. But I think today things have changed a lot, partly under the impact regime of the Research Excellence Framework. Academic historians, I think, now feel a lot of pressure to demonstrate how their research has a wider public value, how it speaks to contemporary concerns and illuminates present-day challenges. And on balance, I think this is probably a good thing for the discipline taken as a whole. But I think it has placed unrealistic expectations on historians, and particularly on early career scholars. So one thing that really strikes me, which was not happening when I was doing my PhD, is the spectacle of PhD students and postdocs furiously writing blogs and opinion pieces on how their, of necessity, very, very specialised area of research relates to some kind of current day problem, and often prompted by whatever news story happens to be going around that week. And some of these blogs are often very interesting, but often the link between their research and the policy problem is quite tenuous. And I also wonder who is actually reading these blogs outside their own academic circle. So I think the institutional pressures within higher education to demonstrate policy impact all the time ought to be relaxed, or perhaps we all ought to sort of step back from it. And I think that a less feverish atmosphere would actually lead to more constructive dialogue between historians and policymakers, because we wouldn't feel this compulsion to see policy relevance in everything that we do. And I think one of the major factors behind this compulsion leads me to my final point. And this is the turf wars that often exist between disciplines. Historians have, I think, felt a bit on the back foot when it comes to demonstrating policy relevance as members of a soft humanities subject rather than a hard social science. I mean, in fact, historians have always drawn on theoretical insights and methodologies from other disciplines in their scholarship. But when it comes to policy, there seems to be the sense that we have to champion history and historians and historical perspectives sometimes explicitly in opposition to other disciplines. So one striking note in David Armitage's History Manifesto is where he says that historians have allowed economists and political scientists to run the show, and now is the time to fight back. And similarly, Ferguson and Allison called for the creation of a council of historians to advise the President of the United States. And I find this a little bit self-regarding and, frankly, kind of unrealistic, the implication being that history provides a superior optic, which is always necessary, rather than representing one kind of perspective on a problem, which might or might not be salient, depending on the circumstances. And I think it also assumes that policymakers, like academics, think about knowledge primarily in disciplinary terms, when, as the theme of this conference suggests, and I think as Douglas Alexander implied this morning, they're much more likely to think about it in terms of evidence. And the key criteria here is not whether you're a historian or a sociologist or a social anthropologist, but rather how reliable, how robust, how useful, and how authoritative is your evidence. You know, so if you're going in to a meeting with Gordon Brown, is your evidence, better than his? So in my view, the way forward then is more interdisciplinary collaboration, which is why I'm so pleased to be on this panel, and a recognition across the humanities and social science disciplines that we all have something potentially to add to the policymakers' intellectual toolkit. And by working together, we're much more likely that the policymakers will actually use evidence from whichever discipline than continue with policymaking without it. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much indeed, Helen. That was excellent. Right, okay, so our final speaker, David Moon, and then we'll open it up to discussion. David.
Okay, I'm very aware of sort of time limits, so I've crossed out about a third of what I was going to say. I'll repeat it to you during the questions anyway. So what can I offer to the discussion? There are sort of three wings from which my research comes. On the one hand, I'm the organizer, the convener of the Political Studies Association Politics and History Specialist Group, but I've got nothing that can be said better about the role of history than we've already had here today. I am also, my research is party politics, in particular looking at intra-party ideological conflict using post-structuralist discourse theory. That's mainly criticising and sort of complexifying what's going on in there. I thought I'd move on from that. I write on devolution, and I was before the House of Lords Constitutional Committee to talk about the future of the Union. But there's an element in which, if I purely go down that route, it's not what you can learn from other disciplines. So I'll come back to that. The other area I work in really is just as a political theorist, and I thought that's how I would look at this discussion. Now, as a political theorist, normally my role has been sort of more parasitic upon the policy-making agenda. I look at the evidence, I look at the policymakers, and then I apply my theories to them and theorize about them. So it's lovely to be here today, having that opportunity to think about sort of other roles that we can have with this. Because some of this comes back to what Helen's already said, is within political theory there is a bit of a problem in terms of how political theorists have engaged within the policy-making process. I think for political theorists there's a fundamental worry within the discipline about the danger of instrumentalization, that the idea is we are here to produce policy in that sense, that power comes to us and says, how can you use your theory to make the existing system work better? So political theory is not something you can, we've all probably been to Waterstones and you've seen the great books on the shelf, 10 things Socrates can tell you about your haircut, and these other sorts of popular sort of pop philosophy, that there's a fear that you don't want to become this sort of drained of sort of the complexities of a system like that. I've had several members of Parliament tell me that when they entered Parliament, colleagues said, all you need to know to be here is to read Machiavelli's The Prince. And I've always thought what on earth they were possibly getting from just picking that text off the shelf and going, Florentine politics, etc. So, the role of political theory isn't to have some sort of Nietzschean aphorism that we can put on a poster behind the wall to make us really think about how we can do things better there. So there's a problem here that already there's sort of, I think, with many political theorists, a concern about being overly simplified and being there to support power. There's a sense that political power, as I'm abstractly talking about it, rejects the idea of education for the sake of education, as Charles Clarke once put it. It's a very dangerous idea. The aim is for us to produce transferable skills when we're teaching here. But again, there's a sort of critical sense that the idea is not to make the status quo better. Daniel Cohen-Bendit, in his book Obsolete Communism from 1968, which is one of my favorites, has a line, the university graduate may revel in his position as a graduate, but he's being fed knowledge like a goose is fed grain ready to be sacrificed on the altar of bourgeois appetites. And that's what I tell my students they need to understand when they come to university. So we are criticizing and critiquing, I feel, sort of the dominant paradigms and understandings. But there are very practical ways that becomes important. And I'll talk about, first of all, to my students, and then I'll talk about how it works in the policy arena. So at a previous university I taught at, with a previous student that I taught who was a white supremacist student who I had the delight of teaching. He's currently been in the news, and he will be in the news again soon, but I'm not going to give him the air of publicity with his name, but he's involved in politics. And I was teaching British politics and multiculturalism and race, etc. And this was the only seminar he turned up to, oddly. And I'd already sat through about 10 seminars in which all the good social democrat politics students, because that's what they were at this university, sat down and went, oh, I think we should be nice to everyone and everyone's equal, etc. And it was great, it was lovely. And then we had this seminar in which he turned and he said, well, I think that, there's a white culture and then there's non-white cultures and they shouldn't be combined because they dilute the cultures. And in a sense, multiculturalism is destroying race and is racist. And this was, and all of the other students just had no idea what to say to this. They had no idea. They knew that this was wrong, and they told them this was wrong, but they didn't actually have any, but they said, well, it's just purely about melatonin levels and genetics. And I was like, well, that's a terrible line of argument, genetics, because you don't want to go down that route. History will tell us that. The literal hand of God will tell us wrong. It's a terrible idea. It was a wonderful realization in a horrible, horrible sense that if people don't understand why they hold the beliefs they hold, what the concepts are that underlines their principles, if you don't know how to defend the reasons you believe in things, as soon as someone comes along and can critique the reasons for this, you're in trouble. And I think that there's a issue here whereby debate over ontology, debate over epistemology, ethics, conceptual foundations, this sort of abstract notion actually becomes incredibly practical in these regards. If you have a post-truth politics, which we've heard a lot about here, it's a lot easier when the side which likes to think it's on the side of truth finds itself actually unable to explain why the other side is talking nonsense, because they've almost lost the theory below the discourse there. And I think we can see this with the last Labour governments in a sense that what I think many people see as a huge areas of social change were quite easily washed away under the Conservative and coalition government because there wasn't the normative embeddedness. They'd made the policy change, but the discourse hadn't solved some of it. Anyway, so shifting to why this is important in terms of policy, I'm not saying that our government and our civil service are all racist, not today anyway. That's another discussion for another seminar on white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. But what I am saying is that there is a problem in which we need to think more about what is the conceptual underpinnings that we have here. Too much of political theory, I think, in this role has not been as useful because it's focused too much on outcomes. Okay, we look about what is justice, okay, and we discuss the debates over justice as fairness, etc. But we've missed the institutional question. We've not really focused as much on, as a theorist, what are the institutional positions that we believe should be the best ones to be set up to shape the normative outcomes we believe in. There's an excellent book recently out by Jeremy Waldron, Political Theory, in which he kind of addresses this, and I highly recommend it, from Harvard University Press. But the question of how should we design our institutions, the question of what is the goal, what is the function, what are the structures, these are normative questions because they are decisions we have to make. And I think political theory has a much larger role to play here. Hannah Arendt, who I'm teaching this year, and because of that, everything I see, I think Hannah Arendt, that's what my answer to everything at the moment, I apologise. But she has this, the basis underlying her works, in particular in On Revolution, the idea that rights shouldn't be abstractly proclaimed, but rather they should be built into the civic structures of particular states and enforced as part of the functioning of our ordinary laws. There is an institutional role which has to be played there. And I want to talk about that very quickly. And I could talk about 4 things. I'll talk about 2 things here to make sure we end on time for discussion. Why this is important. So I work on devolution. And I have a book coming out on devolution, and I've had to push back our deadline. Oh, what a terrible shame for the book. Paul Radcliffe, because of course this year, well, we had all those elections, then we had Brexit, and everything has changed, and we need far more issues to discuss here. But listening to Douglas Alexander today, it was again fascinating thinking about this, because one of the big issues I think we can see within Britain, the United Kingdom, is the question of the union. What is the future of the union? And that's what I was talking to the House of Lords committee on about this. Because one of the things I take away from the Scottish referendum debate is how defenders of the union found it very difficult to explain what the union is for. Why do we want a union? This is an institutional structure, it's a relationship. What's it for beyond it makes me feel nice, we're stronger together to do what, etc. And this is a British problem, I think. There's a wonderful bit in Charles Dickens's Our Mutual Friend where he has a character called Mr. Podsnap. He's talking to a foreign gentleman, that's all he's described as there, and he's explaining the British Constitution, and he says, the British, we are far more lucky than any other country in the world, because our Constitution was designed by Providence. No other country is so lucky. And the foreign gentleman says, and foreign countries, they do how? And Mr. Podsnap goes, foreigners do, I'm afraid to say, as foreigners do. Which I think we can all agree on. But there is this dangerous, I think, that there is a sense in Britain that we still think of Providence, Why does Britain, the United Kingdom, why do we keep referring to it as Britain rather than the United Kingdom? Why does it exist? What's the point? What is it that links us together? Why do we value this? And we kind of just go, well, it just works, doesn't it? It kind of functions. We've never had a revolution, apart from that revolution we had, Things just, they act as which they are, which means when we face a question, which is, what is the point of this union? We kind of end up on really unimpressive arguments. One of the posters for that referendum was, I care about my children, I'm voting Remain, which I always thought sounded like a mafia threat, So yes, it's a lovely family you've got there, it'd be terrible if something happened to them, And we don't have that sort of the normative values for why we want to be doing this. The other one I'll just very quickly touch on here, I could have gone on to the alternative vote, because I really wanted to press everyone in the room. But the other one is sort of discussions at the moment about the alt-right, which I think is one of the interesting buzzwords we've got at the moment. With the alt-right, we keep hearing about this new concept, etc. And there's a danger with this that it's been conceptually stretched beyond all meaning. It kind of just means what we used to call neo-racism, and we used to be using the word populism for this, which was a conceptual stretching of populism. But if you look at the alt-right, there's a number of certain things which actually tap into just basic theories of ideology and political theory. It's a white supremacist, misogynistic, neo-fascist sort of ideology, founded upon ideas of political correctness has gone mad, and you can't say that, it's hard to be a white man. All these classic sort of tropes which have been around for a very long time. And if you have that if we don't recognize the historical history of political ideas there, we can start treating this as some, oh my God, radically new idea. But at the other time, there are radically new elements within this which we mustn't overlook, I think, which is particular ideas around the role of internet subcultures, of 4chan, of doing it for the lulz, of, Gamergate and other sorts of issues, and I think that theorists have to bring that in and also discuss how that works in there. So there's room for the sociologist, the ethnographer, the political theorist, the historian, all of these things have to be regarded in there. So to sum up, and I think I've offered more sort of vague things rather than actually explaining how I'm going to take this to policymakers, rather than saying, yes, Machiavelli, but maybe some other stuff as well there. Let me give you my reading list. Political theory, it's difficult to think of how we can do this. There's no easy way to kind of give a bullet point guide to policymakers to think about this. I think the value in many ways is about questioning the foundations of what we believe in, because I think far too often we don't question the foundations, we just believe in things, but also helping to discuss why it is we believe in that. But the aim of theory is ultimately, I would argue, not everyone would, to change the world. That's why Marx said the philosophers have only tried to interpret it. The point is to change the world. I think praxis is an element of what we need to be doing there. And we don't only need as theorists to be looking at ends, we also need to be looking at the theoretical ends by which the institutional ends by which that theory can be embedded, providing the tools, both theoretical and historical, to explain and identify the ideas which are being discussed, the discourses which are hegemonic, and the ability in which we might want to either combat or embed them in that regard. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, David. Okay, so there's a lot to reflect on there. I mean, certainly if you ever thought that public policy was a sort of stable object that you could study and bound, I think our our perspectives today have sort of shown that that is a much more complex proposition, that public policy is embedded in the flow of historical time as well as in geographical space, that there are different levels of causality that impact on different kinds of policy intervention, and that policymakers themselves bring different theories, perspectives, prejudices, discourses to bear on their political craft. So when you're thinking about interdisciplinary work, it's both sort of necessary but also very difficult. But without it, of course, we may end up, as I hope you've learned from this panel, that without it we end up with very partial, incomplete and inadequate ways of approaching public policy. So